Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Dr. Sayers Teaches Something. Today, in response to a request, we'll be talking about the economy of the 1920s. Now, the 1920s are typically remembered as the Roaring Twenties, a time of social experimentation, of people being freed of the expectations and traditions of the past, of a booming economy, of jazz music and country music, and a pretty exciting time for a lot of people. In many ways, that was true. Although, to really understand the economy of the 1920s, it's important to look back somewhat to the economy of the early 20th century in general. Now, the early 20th century had a pretty good economy for most Americans, with a few exceptions, to be sure. The discovery of gold in Australia and South Africa and Canada, and from America's point of view in particular, Alaska, in the late 1890s, had really eased the deflationary pressures of the late 1800s, so that while the early 20th century did suffer the Panic of 1907 and a small downturn around 1911 or so, it was nothing compared to the Panic of 1873, say, or the Panic of 1893. And the small downturn of, say, 1911 or so was largely mitigated, much more than made up for, in fact, by the First World War, which, while correctly remembered as a great tragedy, was in some ways a blessing in disguise for the United States, at least economically, because when Europe went to war, of course, their need for manufactured goods increased significantly as they needed weapons and all kinds of other supplies, and some factory workers went off to war. And American manufacturing expanded to fill that gap. Likewise, the Allied powers and Central powers, but the Allied powers needed money, and the United States was happy to lend it to them. Indeed, American manufacturers were making so much money, and American bankers had so much money invested in European powers, that later some people would accuse the United States of going to war in the First World War in order to defend the economic interests and protect the loans of American manufacturers and bankers. For American farmers, too, the First World War was a huge blessing, at least economically. And farmers throughout the 1800s had struggled with debt, while new types of technology, better plows, better harvesting equipment, better fertilizers, new types of irrigation, improved breeds of seeds, had made farmers far more productive. It also given them both a reason and a need to take on more debt, to buy all those improved things. And of course, the high levels of production that all that new technology permitted led to crop prices falling. So that farmers often were trapped in a cycle of debt, borrowing money to buy the equipment and supplies they needed to get through each year, in hope and paying that off at the harvest, but then having to borrow again the next year and having to produce even more to make the same money and pay off the same debts the next year. In the moderate inflation that America experienced in the very late 1890s, the early 1900s, it mitigated that somewhat. But with the First World War and Europe's farmers off at the battlefront, or farms themselves churned up into battlefields in northern France or the fields of Flanders, the demand for food increased enormously, and American farmers truly prospered. Although, with so much demand for food, many of them took on even new debt to purchase even more farm equipment. For example, the brand new gasoline-powered combine harvester. So, and the First World War led to a real boom for America's economy. And that continued on, for the most part, into the 1920s. And several things made this possible. Mass production. Of course, this is an idea going back to the 1800s, if not earlier. But it was becoming even more massive in the early 20th century, thanks to the development of the assembly line, which is often attributed to Henry Ford, although that's not entirely accurate. Just as he did not invent the automobile, he did not invent the assembly line. He was inspired, in fact, horrifying as it sounds, by the meatpacking industry, where animals were stripped down and every single part used. Philip Armour, I believe, claimed to use every part of the pig but the squeal. But with the assembly line, with workers' tasks brought to them on a conveyor belt or something like that, so you don't even have to waste a step moving, manufacturing became even more efficient. Indeed, efficiency experts appeared, engineers and social scientists who would study how workers worked in the factory, time their every motion, and figure out how to make those more efficient and productive, which was very effective, although many workers felt very dehumanizing too. The most famous of these efficiency experts was Frederick Winslow Taylor, but my personal favorite efficiency experts are Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. Interesting in and of itself, in that this was a married couple, giving us a